The manse of this meeting house here at Rosemary Street was the birthplace of William Drennan in 1754. The adult Drennan lamented that what he termed the brazen walls of separation which had been erected amongst the inhabitants of Ireland by distinctions of rank, property and religious persuasion. He was to make his life's work the creation of a brotherhood of affection amongst Irishmen of every creed. Wolfe Tone and Thomas Russell arrived in Belfast in October 1791 for a meeting that turned out to be the founding meeting of the United Irish Society. They were welcomed to the town by Drennan's brother-in-law, Sam MacTeer, and Thomas Putnam McCabe, both of whom are members of this congregation. William Drennan had written to Sam, informing him that he was about to form a secret society of dedicated Republicans in Dublin. But when Sam circulated this letter to the Belfast radicals, they decided to seize the initiative. Wolfe Tone tells us how, having imbibed plenty of politics and wine, he found that Thomas Paine's Rights of Man had become what he termed the Quran of Belfast Q. Tone found that while there was strong support amongst the Belfast radicals for the extension of political rights to Roman Catholics, there was an influential minority who were less than sanguine about the matter. Within a few days, at a dinner at Sam MacTeer's, Tone found himself in a furious argument which lasted more than 2 hours with Reverend William Bruce, the Rosemary Street minister. Tone records in his diary that Bruce was an intolerant high priest. Tone's blow was a blow below the belt. Unitarian ministers such as Bruce prided themselves on their tolerance and their opposition to hierarchy or high priesthood. Bruce had finished by saying 30 out of 40 Protestants would be found adverse to the liberation of Roman Catholics. He also expressed his asperity towards what he called the newfangled doctrine of the rights of man. William Bruce and William Drennan had been friends in youth and managed to sustain an element of that friendship, even as they clashed publicly and privately on many political matters over the long years. Drennan had proposed to Bruce the formation of a secret society of dedicated Republicans as early as 1795, but Bruce was totally against the idea and remained so when the United Irish Society came into being 6 years later. When Drennan, along with 18 others, met in the Eustace Street Tavern in the Eagle Tavern in Eustace Street, Dublin, in November 1791, he brought along a test he had proposed to be taken by all members. The test read, "I, in the presence of God, do pledge myself to my country, and I will use all my abilities and influence in the attainment of an impartial and adequate representation of the Irish nation in Parliament, and as a means of absolute and immediate necessity in accomplishing this chief good of Ireland, I shall do whatever lies in my power to forward a brotherhood of affection, an identity of interest, a communion of rights and a union of power amongst Irishmen of every religious persuasion." The test was adopted by the Dublin Society and transmitted to Belfast, where it was also adopted. In February, William Drennan's sister, who was in Belfast, wrote to him in Dublin in a tone of near panic. "You were attacked in the public papers in your character, your religion, your head, and worst of all, your heart. And by whom? That man who, by being for years cherished as your friend, ought to have known its value. He knows, everyone here knows, you were the author of that test. And it is with pain, I add, that as such, I fear you are generally reprobated by those you most esteem here. Some who has gone as far as, when in their cups, to wish that the promoter be hanged at a time when they knew you to be the chief one." Bruce attacked the Irish test in a sermon here at Rosemary Lane before the very pulpit which William Drennan's father had once occupied. The congregation at which Bruce's harangue was directed included Martha MacTeer, Sam, Drennan's mother, and many of the friends of his youth. Not content with confining his opinions to the meeting house, Bruce also published his strictures on the test in the Belfast newsletter. Martha felt that Bruce had stepped out of his way into the pulpit and into the public paper to fix the stigma on his oldest friend. She worried that her brother might be hurt in his profession and be termed a dangerous and a rebellious man. When claiming that she would not presume to advise Drennan, her brother, as to how he should react, she goes on to do that precise thing. She suggests that Drennan should consider a public answer to Bruce. Within a few days, Drennan sent a paper to Sam, which he wished to be shown to Martha and Samuel Nielsen before being sent to Joy's newsletter and Nielsen's new paper, The Morning Star. From early February 1792 until the end of March, the two old friends engaged in a bitter public paper war, with Bruce assailing the test and Drennan robustly defending it. Bruce began his first paper by quoting the full text of the test. He then comprehensively deconstructs it. Firstly, he argues that those who pledge to use all their abilities to achieve certain objectives would have no time left for the ordinary business of life. He further suggests that the pursuit of an impartial representation of the Irish nation implies that every man, adult, minor, nay, every woman would have an equal right to representation. He points out that the test supports universal suffrage, which goes beyond anything existing in America, then in America or France. His next point is that a communion of rights and a union of power would give Roman Catholics, who are 10 times more numerous than Presbyterians, 10 times as much power. Bruce went on to argue that the test was calculated to oblige men never to change their opinion, which is inconsistent with the primary right of man, the freedom of thought. Of course, freedom of thought is a core value of Unitarian worldview, which Bruce and Drennan shared. In Drennan's first answer to Bruce, his main point was that when interpreting the meaning of words and phrases, Bruce defines them only in their loosest and narrowest sense. He keeps swinging between extremes instead of taking words and phrases as they would be taken in common sense by common men. Drennan argues that the test is not a note. A note is a promise to God, whereas the United Irishman's test was a promise to the public. Bruce seemed to enjoy himself when he revised the test to reflect how he interprets Drennan's clarifications. This is Bruce's version of the test. I do not swear, but merely in the presence of God pledge myself to my country till I think better of it. I will use as much of my abilities and influence as I can spare in the attainment of a partial, which I deem to be adequate representation of the Irish nation in Parliament. I will, unless I change my mind, endeavour as much as lies in my inclination to forward progressively a brotherhood of affection, an identity of interest, a communion of rights, and a common exertion among Irishmen of all religious persuasions. Bruce then quotes at great length Drennan's fifth letter of Orellana, which Drennan had written some years previously, in which he asserted that the Catholics of this day are absolutely incapable of making a good use of political liberty. Bruce claims to esteem this letter as the most exquisite morsel of genius and eloquence that this island can boast. He further claims to esteem the author to be the most eminent, ornamental, and the ablest advocate of the Catholic cause. It is difficult to believe that this is Bruce's honestly held opinion. It might suggest the envy of one who had literary pretensions, but who never enjoyed the success Drennan enjoyed with Orellana. Maybe it is an example of what Martha described as Bruce's forte for satire in and out of the pulpit. Perhaps it was sarcasm rather than satire. Drennan refuted the charges of inconsistency regarding Catholic rights between Orellana and the United Irish Test. He invokes the Scottish Enlightenment idea that involvement in commercial society fits people for democratic government. The enlightened and advocated middle class had changed the outlook of Catholics. It might have been better for Drennan to accept that he was wrong in Orellana and had changed his mind. He would later imply that he'd inserted that piece in Orellana at the suggestion of Henry Joy, editor of the Belfast newsletter. A week later, Bruce had the last word. He insisted that as to the emancipation of Roman Catholics, his sentiments were no less liberal than those of the United Irishmen, and he never wished to impeach their intentions. He said that in commencing the controversy, he had sacrificed the feelings his feelings for a sense of duty. He finished with what he described as the words of a wise man. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. When Bruce denounced his old friend work publicly as a Jesuitical composition calculated to deceive, or when he praised Orellana as the most exquisite morsel of genius that this island can boast, were both sentiments the faithful wounds of a friend or the deceitful kisses of an enemy. For his part, Drennan never felt much hurt from the attack, and after he received a letter from Bruce, which does not seem to have survived, he concluded that Bruce had acted from pure motives. Martha was impressed when in early 1796 she read Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. She thought Paine a smart, impudent, imposing writer who ought not to be despised. Most of what Paine had said on the Old Testament had been Martha's thoughts in childhood, and what he said on the New, in her view, would not stagger any rational Christian. Martha's use of the word rational here is important. The Age of Reason, most of which Paine had composed in the shadow of the guillotine in Paris in 1793, was a sustained invective against state religion and all forms of priestcraft, and had indeed staggered many Orthodox Christians. Many Roman Catholics and Anglicans were enraged, but E.P. Thompson, in his classic Making of the English Working Class, has observed that for all the brash provocations of its tone, Paine's work contained little that would have surprised an 18th century deist or advanced Unitarian. Although impressed by Paine, Martha saw an opportunity for her brother to gain some public credit by publishing a response to him. She saw weaknesses in Paine's polemic, particularly in relation to dealing with the New Testament. He appeared to hurry over his subject, as if predetermined to laugh at it rather than confute it. She suggested to her brother that he could answer Paine well with wit and humour, the only way that would secure readers. She had enlisted a biblical scholar, the Reverend William Bryson, who was prepared to help with dates, proofs, authors, etc. And though she invited her brother to laugh at her suggestion, she felt he could do himself honour by enlisting early as the religious adversary of Thomas Paine. For a number of Sundays, Bruce railed against the Age of Reason from the pulpit, and many believed he would publish his sermons in the form of a pamphlet. Drennan said he would be glad to see what he called the Presbyterian Patriarch's answer to Paine, but he did not trouble his heart and his head about the question. When he went on into detail about his own religious sentiments, he was at least partly in sympathy with Paine. The Romanist Church are constantly politicking, denouncing knowledge and debate and disquisition. For the restless power of reason, once introduced, brings in doubt and is apt to beget incredulity. Trust like a papist, for if you doubt like a dissenter, the same restless facility which rejects the Anastasian creed will begin to nibble at the incarnation, the miraculous conception, etc., and thus Priestley lifts the latch for Paine to enter. In 1799, Drennan gave vent to strident anti-clericalism when he declared, "I believe the priesthood in all ages to be the curse of Christianity, and I believe that there will never be happiness or virtue on the face of the earth until that order of men be abolished, and until there be a greater equality of property, which may deliver the rich and the poor from the vices incident to their conditions." He had friends in the Presbyterian ministry, but even they were not spared his disdain. Drennan always opposed in principle the Regium Donum, the royal bounty bestowed on the Presbyterian clergy by the government. He once described it as a slow poison pouring into the Protestant dissenting churches. He told Martha, "In our churches, I have always considered the increase in the Regium Donum as hush money, a bounty to be quiet and to have very tolerably answered its end. I think them, the Presbyterian clergy, nothing more or less than pensioners of government. These once formidable Puritans in name and nature, these upright independents, now depend and bow in exact ratio to the bounty bears to the sum of their incomes." In 1792, Reverend Robert Black of Derry came to Dublin seeking an increase in the payments. Drennan believed that if Black was successful, the Presbyterian religion would be contaminated by the corruption of its pastors. Black had been threatened with being tarred and feathered and accused of coming to Dublin to sell the Presbyterian clergy to the government for a pension on condition of their repudiating the Catholics. Drennan felt that the clergy of the North might lose some of their influence by courting dependency on a rascally government. In the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion, Lord Castlereagh created a new Regium Donum scheme with three objectives. Firstly, he wished to reward those who had committed themselves in support of the state against what he regarded as the Democratic Party within the Senate. He believed that many of those he deemed the Democratic Party, if not involved in the rebellion, were deeply infected by its principles. Secondly, he wished to create a considerable internal fermentation, perhaps even a schism, to change the temper of the synod. Finally, he wanted to buy and consolidate support for the union amongst the Presbyterian clergy. Castlereagh believed that making the Presbyterian clergy less dependent on their congregations for their subsistence would make them better subjects than they have late years proven themselves to be. His scheme involved differing amounts being paid to differing classes of ministers depending on seniority and the size of the congregation. Drennan and some of the Presbyterian elders and clergy saw this as an attempt to create a dissenting hierarchy. Martha agreed with her brother, and she denounced the ministers who accepted the bounty as fallen men. Yes, they had a station, a high one, for which it was necessary for government to overset them, and £100 a year has done it, without one honest soul daring to spur the bribe. Castlereagh's allies in the synod were Reverend Robert Black and Reverend William Bruce. When Drennan became aware of Black and Bruce's contact with Castlereagh, he described Bruce as a presbyter bishop and said that Bruce and Castlereagh were walking hand in hand in a new alliance of church and state. He invoked the great names of non-subscription of an earlier generation. Is this possible? Can the dissenters repair to their meeting houses after such a business is completed? Is it possible that any lay dissenter who preserves or is preserved in the salt of a sect can set foot into a house corrupted by such a pensionary establishment? What would Abernethy, Ducal and Hutchinson have thought of the descendants? But it is a link in a chain of events which is tending towards the abolition of such an order of men in the world. Infected, corrupted, papisticated, mankind will grow disgusted with their selfishness and their hypocrisy, as they have already done on the continent. And the tyranny of the priesthood will no longer usurp the throne of God or stand between man and his maker. Martha heard reports that the laity and elders of the synod were opposed to accepting Castlereagh's new scheme and had managed to reject it at the synod. She urged her brother to write a pamphlet to rouse the Presbyterian laity into some sense of justice and honour, that they might make better provision for their ill-rewarded pastors. Drennan refused to write on this subject because he felt that order of men, the clergy, were losing all hold over the people, and that therefore he thought it improbable that their stipends would be raised by the people. Drennan asserted that the priesthood in all ages were the curse of Christianity. There would be no virtue or happiness in the world until the priesthood was abolished. He agreed with Paine's argument in The Age of Reason that Christian miracle stories had been invented to chill the ignorant and stupid into belief. Yet Drennan remains a Protestant dissenter and a Presbyterian, and regarded himself as a Christian. The schism which Castlereagh had conspired at to weaken the Democrats within the Presbyterian synod did not occur until he and William Drennan were long dead. When it came about finally, those who were driven out were not asked about their attitude to the United Irish Rebellion. Neither were they asked if they were Democrats or supporters of democratic rights. They were asked if they believed in the deity of Jesus. Ironically, one of those who could not answer that question to the satisfaction of the synod was Castlereagh's loyal presbyter bishop, William Bruce. The union of Irishmen which Drennan advocated evaporated as Orange Unionism and Catholic nationalism went their separate ways in mutual animosity. 200 years have passed since William Drennan's death. In all that time, Drennan's hometown of Belfast has known sectarian hatred and intercommunal tensions, often exploding into murder and mayhem. The brazen walls of separation are no longer just an elegant metaphor honed by William Drennan. No, they are the ugly physical constructs called with no sense of irony the Peace Wall. These brazen walls of separation have been erected at the request of residents on both sides to keep Belfast's most deprived citizens apart.